Imagine, if you can, a small room, hexagonal in shape, the cell of a bee. It's lighted neither by window nor by lamp, yet it's filled with soft radiance. There are no apertures for ventilation, yet the air is fresh. There are no musical instruments, and yet, at the moment that my meditation opens, this room is throbbing with melodious sound. An armchair is in the center. By its side, a reading desk that is all the furniture. And in the armchair, there's a swaddled lump of flesh. A woman about 5 feet high, with a face as white as fungus. It is to her that the little room belongs. An electric bell rang. Vashti's next move was to turn off the isolation switch, and all the accumulations of the last 3 minutes burst upon her. The room was filled with the noise of bells and speaking tubes. What was the new food like? Could she recommend it? Had she had any ideas lately? Might one tell her own ideas? Would she make an engagement to visit the public nurseries at an early date? Say, this month? To most of these questions she replied with irritation, a growing quality in that accelerated age. She said that the new food was horrible, and she would not visit the public nurseries or some press engagement. She had no idea about her own, but she had just been told one. 4 stars and 3 in the middle were like a man. She doubted that very much. Then she switched off her correspondence, for it was time to deliver her lecture on Australian music. The clumsy system of public gatherings had been long since abandoned. Neither Vashti nor her audience stirred from their rooms. Seated in her armchair, she spoke, while they in their armchairs heard her fairly well and saw her fairly well. She opened with a humorous account of music in the pre-Mongolian epoch, and went on to describe the great outbursts of song that followed the Chinese conquest. Remote and primeval as were the methods of San Tso and the Brisbane school. She yet felt, she said, the study then might repay the musicians of today. They had freshness, they had above all ideas. Her lecture, which lasted 10 minutes, was well received, and at its conclusion, she and many of her audience listened to a lecture on the sea. There were ideas to be gotten from the sea, and the speaker had donned a respirator and visited lately. Then she fed, talked to many friends, had a bath, talked again, and summoned her bed. The bed was not to her liking. It was too large. She had a feeling for a small bed. Complaint was useless, for beds were of the same dimension all over the world, and to have an alternative site would have involved vast alterations in the machine. Vashti isolated herself. It was necessary, for neither day nor night existed under the ground, and reviewed all that had happened since she had summoned the last bed. Ideas? Scarcely any. Events? Was Kuno's invitation an event? By her side, on the little reading desk, was a survival from the ages of litter. One book. This was the book of the machine. In it were instructions against every possible contingency. If she was hot or cold or dyspeptic or at a loss for words, she went to the book, and it told her which button to press. The Central Committee published it. In accordance with growing habit, it was richly bound. Sitting up in the bed, she took it reverently in her hands. She glanced round the glowing room as a song one might be watching her. Then, half ashamed, half joyful, she murmured, "Oh, machine," and raised the volume to her lips. Thrice she kissed it, thrice inclined her head, thrice she felt the delirium of acquiescence. Her ritual performed, she turned to page 1367, which gave the times of the departure of the airship from the island in the southern hemisphere, under whose soil she lived, to the island in the northern hemisphere, where under her son lived. She thought, I have not the time. Of course, she knew all about the communication system. There was nothing mysterious in it. She would summon a car and it would fly her down to the tunnel until it reached the lift of the communicated with the airship station. The system had been in use for many, many years, long before the universal establishment of the machine. And of course she had studied the civilization and immediately proceeded her own. The civilization had mistaken the function of the system and had used it for bringing people to things, instead of for bringing things to people. Those funny old days, when men went for change of air instead of changing the air in their rooms. And yet, she was frightened of the tunnel. She had not seen it since her last child was born. It curved, but not quite as she remembered. It was brilliant, but not quite as brilliant as a lecturer had suggested. Vashti was seized with the terror of direct experience. She shrank back into the room. The wall closed up again. "Kuno, I can't come see you. I'm not well." And immediately an enormous apparatus fell onto her out of the ceiling. A thermometer was automatically laid upon her heart. She lay powerless. Cool pads soothed her forehead. Kuno had telegraphed to her doctor. So, the human passion still blundered up and down in the machine. Vashti drank the medicine the doctor projected into her mouth, and the machinery retired into the ceiling. The voice of Kuno was heard, asking how she felt. "Better? But why do you not come to me instead?" "Because I cannot leave this place." "Why?" "Because any moment something tremendous may happen." "Have you been to the surface of the earth?" "Not yet." "Then what is it?" "I will not tell you. Not through the machine." And so she resumed her life. She thought of Kuno as a baby, his birth, his removal to the public nurseries, her own visit to him there, his visit to her, visits which stopped when the machine had assigned him a room on the other side of the earth. "Parents' duties of," said the book of the machine, "cease at the moment of birth. P422327-483. True. There was something special about Kuno. Indeed, there had always been something special about all her children, and after all, she must brave the journey if he desired it. And something tremendous might happen. What did he mean? The nonsense of a youthful man, no doubt. But she must go. And again she pressed the unfamiliar button. Again the wall swung back, and she saw the tunnel that oozes out of sight. Clasping the book, she rose, tottered on the platform, summoned the car. Her room closed behind her. The journey to the northern hemisphere had begun. Of course, it was perfectly easy. The car approached, and she found armchairs exactly like her own. When she signaled, it stopped. She tottered into the lift. One other passenger was in the lift. The first fellow creature she had seen face to face for months. She traveled in these days, for thanks to the advance of science, the Earth was exactly alike all over. Rapid intercourse, from which previous civilizations had hoped so much, had ended by defeating itself. What was the good of going to Peking when it was just like Shrewsbury? Were I returned to Shrewsbury, would all be like Peking. Men now seldom moved their bodies. All unrest was concentrated. The airship service was a relic from the former age. It was kept up because it was easier to keep it up than to stop it or diminish it, but now far exceeded the warmth of the population. Vessel after vessel would rise from the vomitories of Rye and Christchurch. One used the antique names. And they would sail under the crowded sky and would draw up at the wharves of the south, empty. So nicely adjusted was the system, so independent of meteorology, that the sky, whether calm or cloudy, resembled a vast kaleidoscope whereupon the same patterns periodically recurred. The ship on which Vashti sailed started now at sunset, now at dawn. But always, as it passed above the realms, it would neighbor the ship that served between Hellingsfors and Brazil. And every third time, it summoned the Alps, The fleet of Palermo would cross its track behind. Night and day, wind and storm, tide and earthquake. They impeded man no longer. He had harnessed Leviathan, all the old literature, with the praise of nature and its fear of nature, rang false as the prattle of a child. And yet, as Vashti saw the vast flank of the ship, stained with exposure to the outer air, her horror of direct experience returned. It was not quite like the airship of the cinemaphobe. For one thing, it smelled. Not strongly or unpleasantly, but it did smell. And with her eyes shut, she could have known that a new thing was close to her. Then she had to walk to it from the lift, had to submit to glances from the other passengers. The man in front dropped his book, no great matter, but it disquieted them all. And in the room, the book was dropped. The floor raised it mechanically, but the gangway to the airship was not so prepared, and the sacred volume lay motionless. They stopped. The thing was unforeseen, and the man, instead of picking up his property, felt the muscle of his arm to see how they failed him. Then someone actually said, with direct utterance, "We'll be late." And they trooped on board, Vashti treading on the pages as she did so. Inside, her anxiety increased. The arrangements were old-fashioned and rough. There was even a female attendant to whom she would have to announce her once during the voyage. Of course, a revolving platform ran the length of the boat, but she was expected to walk from it to her cabin. Some cabins were better than others. She did not get the best. She thought the attendant had been unfair, and spasms of rage shook her. The glass valves had closed. She could not go back. She saw, at the end of the vestibule, the lift, which she had ascended, going quietly up and down, empty. And beneath those corridors of shining tiles were rooms, tier below tier, reaching far under earth. In each room there sat a human being, eating, sleeping, producing ideas. And buried deep in the hive was her own room. And Vashti felt afraid. "A machine," she murmured, caressed her book, and she was comforted. Then, the sides of the vestibule seemed to melt together, as do the passages that we see in dreams. The lift vanished. The book had been dropped, slid to the left, and vanished. Polished tiles rushed by like streams of water. There was a slight jar, and the airship, issuing from its tunnel, soared from the waters of a tropical ocean. And it was night. For a moment she saw the coast of Sumatra edged by the phosphorescent waves, crowned by a lighthouse, still sending forth their disregarded beams. These also vanished, and only the stars distracted her. They were not motionless. They swayed to and fro above her head, thronging out of skylight into another, as if the universe and not the airship was careening. And as often happens on clear nights, they seemed now to be in perspective, now on a plane, now piled tier beyond tier into the infinite heavens, now concealing infinity, a roof limiting forever. In either case, they seemed intolerable. "Are we to travel in the dark?" called the passengers angrily, and the attendant, who had been careless, generated the light and pulled down the blinds of pliable metal. When the airships had been built, the desire to look direct at things still lingered in the world. Hence the extraordinary number of skylights and windows, and the proportionate discomfort to those who were civilized and refined. Even in Vashti's cabin, one star peeped through, a flaw in the blind, and after a few hours of uneasy slumber, she was disturbed by an unfamiliar glow. It was the dawn. Quick as the ship had sped westward, the earth had rolled eastward quicker still, and had dragged back Vashti and her companions toward the sun. Science could prolong the night, for only a little while Those high hopes of neutralizing the Earth's diurnal revolution had passed, together with hopes that were possibly higher. To keep pace with the sun, to even outstrip it, had been the aim of civilization preceding this. Racing aeroplanes had been built for the purpose, capable of enormous speed, and steered by the greatest intellects of the epoch. Round the globe they went, round and round, westward, round, amidst humanity's applause, of course. And in vain, the globe went eastward, quicker still. Horrible accidents occurred, and the Committee of the Machine, at the time rising into prominence, declared the pursuit illegal, unmechanical, and punishable by homelessness. Doubtless the committee was right. Yet, the attempt to defeat the sun aroused the last common interest that our race experienced about the heavenly bodies, or indeed about anything. It was the last time that men were compacted by thinking of power outside the world. The sun had conquered, yet it was the end of his spiritual dominion. Dawn, midday, twilight, the zodiacal path touched neither men's lives nor their hearts. Forever retreated in the ground, exonerated himself upon problems that were certain of solving. So, when Vashti found her cabin invaded by a rosy finger of light, she was annoyed and tried to adjust the blind. But the blind flew up altogether. She saw through the skylight small pink clouds swaying against the background of blue, and the sun crept higher. Its radiance entered direct, brimming down the wall like a golden sea. It rose and fell with the airship's motion, just as waves rise and fall, but it advanced steadily as tides advance. Unless she was careful, it would strike her face. A spasm of horror shook her. She rang for the attendant. The attendant, too, was horrified, but she could do nothing. It was not her place to mend the blind. She could only suggest a lady exchange her cabin, which she accordingly prepared to do. People were almost exactly alike all over the world, but the attendant of the airship, perhaps owing to her exceptional duties, had grown a little out of the common. She had often to address passengers with direct speech, and this had given her a certain roughness and originality of manner. When Vashti swerved away from the sunbeam with the cry, she behaved barbarically. She put out her hand, touched her to steady her. By a vestibule, by a lift, by a tubular railway, by a platform, then a sliding door. By reversing all the steps of her departure, did Vashti finally arrive at her son's room, which exactly resembled her own. She might as well declare that the visit was superfluous. The button, the knobs, the reading desk with the book, the temperature, the atmosphere, the illumination, all were exactly the same. And if Kuno himself, flesh of her flesh, stood close behind her at last, what profit was there in that? She was too well bred to shake him by the hand. Averting her eyes, she spoke as follows. Here I am. I have had the most terrible journey, and greatly retarded development of my soul. But it's not worth it, Kuno. It's not worth it. My time is too precious. The sunlight almost touched me. I have met with the rudest people. I can only stop a few minutes. Say, what do you want to say? Tell me so I can return. Mother, I've been threatened with homelessness, said Kuno. She looked at him now. I have been threatened with homelessness, and I could not tell you such a thing through the machine. She shook her head and said, Don't talk of such terrible things. You make me miserable. You're throwing civilization away. Mother, I've been to the surface. I had to get back a sense of space, where a man can rest. I determined to get it in a hole and climb the shaft, and so I exercised my arms. Day after day, I went through ridiculous movements until my flesh ached, and I could hang by my hand, hold the plow of my bed outstretched for minutes. Then I summoned a respirator, and I started off. It was easy at first. The mortar had somehow rotted, and I soon pushed some more tiles in, and hammered after, then into the darkness. And the spirits of our dead ancestors, they comforted me. She sighed. Mother, can you not see? Cannot all your lecturers see? This is what we are dying. Down here, the only thing that really lives is the infernal machine. We created a machine to do our will. We cannot make it to do our will now. It was robbed of us, and it robbed us of the sense of space and of self and of touch. It's blurred every human relation, narrowed down love to a carnal act. It's paralyzed our bodies and our wills, and now it compels us to worship it. The machine develops, but not in our lines. The machine just proceeds, but not to our goal. We only exist as the blood of the corpses run through arteries. If it could work without us, Mother, it would let us die. Oh, I have a remedy, though. At least one to tell men again and again that I have been to the surface. I have seen the hills of Wessex, saw where they overthrew the Danes and saw the sunset. And I forgot to mention that a belt of mist lay between my hill and the other hills, and that it was the color of He broke off for the second time, and they sat there a long time in silence. Go on, said his mother wearily, but he shook his head. Go on. Nothing that you say can distress me now. I'm hardened. Vashti stood irresolute. All her nerves were tingling with his blasphemies. Here his story ended. Disgust of it was impossible. Vashti turned to go. It will end in homelessness. Oh, I wish it would. The machine has been most merciful. By that superstitious phrase, do you mean that you could live off the outside air, son? Yes. Have you ever seen around the vomitories the bones of those who were extruded after the Great Rebellion? Yes. They were left where they perished for our edification. A few crawled away, but they perished too. Who can doubt it? And so with the homeless of our own day, the surface of the earth supports life no longer. Ferns and little gray mass survive, but all higher forms have perished, son. Has any airship detected them? No. And why this obstinacy? Because I have seen them. Seen what? I have seen her in the twilight. Because she came to my help when I called. Another human being out there in the world, living on the surface. And when I saw her, she became entangled by these electronic worms. And luckier than I, was killed by one of them piercing her throat. He was mad. Vashti departed. In the troubles that followed, she never saw his face again. During the years that followed, two important developments took place in the machine. On the surface, they were revolutionary, but in either case, men's minds had been prepared beforehand, and they did not express tendencies that were latent already. The first of these was the abolition of the respirators. Advanced thinkers like Vashti had always held it foolish to visit the surface of the Earth. Airships might be necessary, but what was the good of going out for mere curiosity, crawling along for a mile in 2 territorial motors? The habit was vulgar, perhaps faintly improper. It was unproductive of ideas, and had no connection with the habit that really mattered. So respirators were abolished, and with them, of course, the terrestrial motors, except for a few lecturers who complained that they were debarred access for the subject matter. The development overall was accepted, quietly. Those who still wanted to know what the Earth was like had, after all, only to listen to some gramophone or look into some cinema photo. And even the lecturers acquiesced, and they found that a lecture on the sea was nonetheless stimulating when compiled out of other lectures that had already been delivered. "Beware of first-hand ideas," explained one of the most advanced of them. "First-hand ideas do not really exist. They are but the physical impressions produced by love, fear, for the gross foundation. Who could erect a philosophy like that? Let your ideas be second-hand, I say, if possible 10th-hand, for then you'll be far removed from that disturbing element, direct observation. Do not learn anything about the subject of mind. Learn instead what I think of the subject of mind. The French Revolution, no. Urizen, yes. Gutsch, Hung Young, Chibo Singh. Through the medium of these great minds, the blood that was shed at Paris and the windows that were broken at Versailles will be clarified to an idea which you may employ most profitably in your daily lives. But be sure that the intermediates are many and varied. For in history, one authority exists to counteract another. Urizen must counteract scepticism, Ho Young and Ikramon. I myself counteract the impetuosity of Gutsch. You who listen to me are in a better position to judge." His voice rose. "There will come a generation that had got beyond facts, beyond impressions, a generation absolutely colorless, a generation spherically free from the taint of personality, which will see the French Revolution not as it happened, nor as they would like it to have happened, but as it would have happened had it taken place in the days of the machine." And there were tremendous applause. They greeted the lecturer. He did his best. His voice was feeling already latent in the mind of men, feeling that terrestrial fact must be ignored. The abolition of respirators was a positive gain. It was even suggested that airships should be abolished too. That was done because airships had somehow worked themselves into the machine system. But year by year they were used less, mentioned less by thoughtful men. The second great development was the re-establishment of religion. This too, having voice in the celebrated lecture. No one could mistake the reverent tone in which the peroration had concluded. It awakened a responsive echo in the heart of each. Those who had long worshipped silently now began to talk. They described the strange feeling of peace that came over them when they handed the book of the machine, the pleasure that it was to repeat certain numerals out of it, however little meaning those numerals conveyed to the outward ear, the ecstasy of touching a button, however unimportant, or the ringing of an electric bell, however superfluously. The machine feeds us, clothes us, houses us. Through it we speak to one another. Through it we see one another. And in it we have our being. The machine is the friend of ideas and the enemy of superstition. The machine is omnipotent, eternal. Blessed is the machine. And before long, this allocution was printed on the first page of the book, and in subsequent editions the ritual swelled into a complicated system of praise and prayer. The word religion was studiously avoided, and in theory the machine still the creation of the impetus man, but in practice all save a few retrogrades, worshipped it as divine. Nor was it worshipped in unity. One believer was chiefly impressed by the blue optic plates, through which he saw other believers, another by a mending apparatus, with sinful Kuno compared to worms, another by the lifts, another by the book, and each would pray to this or that, ask it to intercede with him and the machine as a whole. Persecution, that also was present. Did not break out for reasons that will be set forward shortly, but it was latent, and all who did not accept the minimum known as undenominational mechanism lived in danger of homelessness. To attribute these great developments to the Central Committee is to take a very narrow view of civilization. The Central Committee announced the developments, it's true, but they were no more the cause of them than were the kings of the imperialistic period the cause of war. Rather did they yield to some invincible pressure, which came no one knew whither and which, when gratified, was succeeded by some new pressure, equally invincible. To such a state of affairs is convenient to give the name of progress. No one confessed the machine was out of hand. Year by year it was served with increasing efficiency and decreased intelligence. The better a man knew his duties upon it, the less he understood the duties of his neighbor. In all the world there was not one who understood the monster as a whole. Those master brains had perished. They had left full directions, it's true, and their successors had each of them mastered a portion of those directions. But humanity, in its desire for comfort, had overreached itself, had exploited the riches of nature too far. Quietly in complacency, it was sinking into decadence, and progress had come to mean the progress of the machine. As for Vashti, her life went peacefully. Forward on, until the final disaster. She made her room dark and slept. She awoke and made her room light. She lectured and attended lectures. She exchanged ideas with her innumerable friends and believed she was growing more spiritual. At times, a friend was granted euthanasia, left his or her room for the homelessness that's beyond all human conception. But Vashti did not mind much. After an unsuccessful lecture, she would sometimes ask for a euthanasia herself. The death rate was not permitted to exceed the birth rate, and the machine was hitherto refused it to her. The trouble began, quietly, long before she was conscious of them. One day, she was astonished at receiving a message from her son. They had never communicated, having nothing in common. She had only heard indirectly that he was still alive. Had been transferred from the northern hemisphere, where he had behaved so mischievously, to the southern, to a room not far from her own. Does he want me to visit him? Never again. Never. And I have not the time. No. He refused to visualize his face upon the blue plate. And speaking out of the darkness, with solemnity, she heard the voice of her son. Some kind of madness of another kind. The machine. It's stopping. What did you say? The machine is stopping. I know it. I know the signs. And she burst into a pearl of laughter. He heard her and was angry, and they spoke no more. Can you imagine anything more absurd? A man who was my son believes the machine is stopping. It would be envious if it was not mad. The machine is stopping? What does that even mean? The phrase conveys nothing to me. It does not refer, I suppose, to the trouble there's been lately. With the music? Oh no, of course not. Let's talk about the music. Have you complained to the authorities? Yes. They say it wants mending and referred me to the committee of the mending apparatus. I complained of those curious gasping sighs that disfigure the symphonies of the Brisbane school. They sound like someone in pain. The committee of the mending apparatus say that it shall be remedied shortly. Obscurely worried, she resumed her life. For one thing, the defect in the music irritated her. For another thing, she could not forget Kuno's speech. If he had known the music was out of repair, he could not know it. He detested music anyway. If he had known it, he was wrong. The machine stops was exactly the venomous sort of remark he would have made. Of course he would make a venture, but the coincidence annoyed her. She spoke with some petulance to the committee of the mending apparatus, and they replied as before, that the defect would be set right shortly. Shortly? At once? Why should I be worried about my imperfect music? It's always put right at once. If you do not mend it at once, I shall complain to the Central Committee. Ma'am, no personal complaints are received by the Central Committee. And who am I to make my complaint then? Through us. Well, I complain. Your complaint has been forwarded in its turn. The question was unmechanical. The commending of the memory apparatus refused to answer it. It's too bad. There never was such an unfortunate woman as myself. I can never be sure of my music now. It gets worse and worse each time I summon it. Yeah, I'm having troubles too. Sometimes my ideas are interrupted by a slight jarring noise. What is it? I don't know. I don't know if it's inside my head or inside the wall. Well, I'll complain in either case. Time passed, and they resented the defects no longer. The defects had been remedied, but the human tissues in the latter day had become so subservient that they readily adapted themselves to every caprice of the machine. The sigh, the cries of the Brisbane Symphony no longer irritated Vashti. She accepted it as part of the melody. The jarring noise, whether in the head or in the wall, was no longer resented by her friend. So with the moldy artificial fruit. So with the bath water that began to stink. So with the defective rhymes that the poetry machine had taken to emit. All were bitterly complained of at first, and then acquiesced in and forgotten. It was otherwise with the failure of the sleeping apparatus, though. That was a more serious stoppage. There came a day when over the whole world, Sumatra and Wessex and the innumerable cities of Gowerland and Brazil, the beds, when summoned by their tired owners, failed to appear. It may seem a ludicrous matter, but from it we may date the collapse. The committee responsible for the failure was assailed by the complaints, whom it referred as usual to the committee of the mending apparatus, who in turn assured them that their complaints would be forwarded to the Central Committee. But the discontent grew, for mankind was not yet sufficiently adapted to do without sleep. Someone's meddling with the machine. Someone's trying to make himself king. Punish that man with homelessness. Avenge the machine. Avenge the machine. But the committee of the mending apparatus now came forward and allayed the panic with well-chosen words. It confessed that the mending apparatus was itself in need of repair. The effects of this frank confession was admirable. Of course, said a famous lecturer, of course we shall not press our complaints now. The mending apparatus has treated us so well in the past that we all sympathize with it, and we will wait patiently for its recovery. In its own good time it will resume its duties. Meanwhile, let us do without our beds, our tabloids, our other little wants. Such, I feel sure, would be the wish of the machine. Thousands of miles away, his audience applauded. The machine still linked them. Under the seas, beneath the roots of the mountain, ran the wires through which they saw and heard, the enormous eyes and ears through which was their heritage, and the hum of many working, closed through their thoughts in one garment. Only the old and the sick remained ungrateful, for it was rumored that euthanasia too was out of order, and that pain had reappeared among men. It became difficult to read. A blight entered the atmosphere and dulled its luminosity. At times Vashti could scarcely see across her room. The air, too, was foul. Loud were the complaints, impotent the remedies, heroic the tone of the lecturers. They said, "Courage, courage." And though things improved again after a time, the old brilliancy was never recaptured, and humanity never recovered from its entrance into twilight. There was hysterical talk of measures and provisional dictatorship. The inhabitants of Sumatra were asked to familiarize themselves with the workings of the central power station, the said power station being situated in France. But for the most part, panic reigned. Men spent their strength praying with their books, tangible proof of the machine's omnipotence. There were gradations of terror at times, came rumors of hope. The mending apparatus was almost mended. The enemies of the machine had been gotten under. But there came a day when, without the slightest warning, without any previous hint of feebleness, the entire communications system broke down all over the world, and the world lay as they understood it. And Vashti was lecturing at the time. Her earlier remark had been punctuated with applause. She preceded the audience and became silent, and at the conclusion there was a sound. Somewhat displeased, she called to a friend who was a specialist in symphony. No sound. Doubtless the friend was sleeping. And so with the next friend whom she tried to summon. And so with the next, till she remembered Kuno's cryptic remark. The phrase still conveyed nothing. If eternity was stopping, it would of course be set going shortly. For example, it was still light, little in air. The atmosphere had improved a few hours previously. There was still the book, and while there was the book, there was security. And then she broke down. With the cessation of activity came an unexpected terror. Silence. She had never known silence, and the coming of it nearly killed her. It did kill many thousands of people outright. Ever since her birth, she had been surrounded by the steady hum. It was to the ear what artificial air was to the lungs. An agonizing pain shot across her head, and scarcely knowing what she did, she stumbled forward and pressed the unfamiliar button, one that opened the door of her cell. Now the door of the cell worked on a simple hinge of its own. It wasn't connected to the central power station, dying far away. It opened, rousing immoderate hopes in Vashti. She thought that the machine had been mended. It opened, and she saw the dim tunnel that curved far away toward freedom. One look, she shrank back, for the tunnel was full of people. She was almost the last in the city to have taken alarm. People at any time repelled her, and these were nightmares from her worst dreams. People were crawling about. People were screaming, whimpering, gasping for breath, touching each other, vanishing in the dark, and ever and anon being pushed off the platform onto the live rail. Some were fighting around the electric bells, trying to summon trains which could not be summoned. Others were yelling for euthanasia, for respirators, or blaspheming the machine. Others stood at the doors of their cells fearing, like herself, either to stop in them or to leave them. Behind all the uproar was silence. No. It was worse than solitude. She closed the door again and sat down to wait for the end. The disintegration went on, accompanied by horrible cracks and rumblings. The valves that restrained the medical apparatus must have weakened, for it ruptured and hung hideously from the ceiling. The floor heaved and fell and flung her from the chair. A tube oozed toward her serpent fashion. And at last, a final horror approach. Light began to ebb, and she saw that civilization's long day was closing. She whirled around, praying to be saved from this at any rate, kissing the book, pressing button after button. And the uproar outside was increasing, even penetrated the wall. And slowly the brilliancy of her cell was dimmed. The reflection faded from the metal switches. Now, she could not see the reading stand. Now not the book, though she held it in her hand. And light followed the flight of sound. Air was following light. And the original void returned to the cavern from which it had long excluded. And Vashti continued to whirl, with the devotees of an earlier religion, screaming, praying, striking at buttons with bleeding hands. It was thus that she opened her prison and escaped in the spirit. At least so it seems. She escaped the body. She struck, by chance, the switch that released the door, and the rush of foul air on her skin, the loud throbbing whispers in her ears, told her that she was facing the tunnel again, and that tremendous platform on which she had seen men fighting. They were not fighting now. Only the whispers remained, and the little whispering groans. They were dying by hundreds out in the dark. She burst into tears. Tears answered her. They wept for humanity. Those two, not for themselves. They could not bear that this should be the end. Ere silence was completed, their hearts were opened, and they knew what had been important on earth. Man, the flower of flesh, the noblest creatures visible. Man who had once had made God in his image, had mirrored his strength on the constellations. Beautiful naked man, strangled in the garments that he had woven. Century after century had he toiled, and here was his reward. And truly the garment had seemed heavenly at first, shot with color, sewn with thread. And heavenly it had been so long, as it was a garment no more. Man could shed at will, live by the essence. The sin against the body, it was for that they wept in chief. The centuries of wrong against the muscle and nerve. The last sloshy stirrings of spirit that grasp the stars. Where are you? Is there any hope, Kuno? Where are you? She crawled over the bodies of the dead. Then he heard him. She heard his voice. She felt his touch. I'm dying. But we touch. And we talk. But Kuno, is it true? Are there still men on the surface of the earth? I have seen them. Spoken to them. They are hiding in the mists and the ferns. And as Kuno began to smoke, the whole city was broken like a honeycomb. An airship sailed through the vomitory into a ruined wharf, and it crashed downward, exploding as it went, rending gallery after gallery with the wings of steel. And for a moment they saw the nations of the dead, and before they joined them, seraphs of the untainted sky.